5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Well, I think we're here all together. We're glad to be here on a Thursday night. My name is Crowe, and I'm here with some of my former students, undergraduate and graduate students from this last year. And they've all done some extensive reading in young adult literature, contemporary and stuff back in the mid-20th century. And have done remarkable work as readers and students, and seem like the kind of people who'd be just right to talk about what do Latter-day Saints do when they read tough texts. So I think maybe we should start by introducing ourselves. You guys can introduce yourselves. I'm Crowe. These guys are all in my class, either fall or spring term. So Kristie, why don't you start? Introduce yourself.
I'm Kristie Jolley, and I'm a graduate student. Is that what it's called? I'm getting a master's degree. And I'm excited to also work with Chris, doing a mentorship with him in young adult lit this fall as well. Is that all that we need to do for our intro? Perfect.
How about you?
Sorry, I think you said me. My name is Rachel. I just finished my senior year. I took the YA Lit class from Dr. Crowe in fall of this last year.
Thanks, Rachel. Claire, you want to go next?
Sure. I'm Claire. I'm also a student at BYU. I'm in the English teaching program, so I have one more year left, but I just took the YA literature class in the fall, I believe, fall semester. So.
Thanks, Claire. Corbin?
Yeah, so it looks like my audio is slightly delayed from the video, but my name's Micah Corvin. I'm also was in Professor Crowe's class. We did a lot of reading like that. I'm a creative writing major right now. Wanted to write some awesome books like Brandon Sanderson. You can try for glory, but we'll see where it gets.
Thanks, Corbin. Kaylee?
Yeah, my name's Kaylee. I'm also a graduate student. I'm in my last year of the program, and then I'm a high school English teacher at Provo High, starting my 4th year of English teaching.
Thanks, Kaylee. And Natalie?
Yep, I'm Natalie. I'm also a master's student at BYU. I took YA literature from Chris when I was an undergrad, and I just took another YA lit class from him this spring. So as you can tell, I love YA literature, and I'm hoping to make it a focus of my master's of English.
Thanks, Natalie. So you guys, we've got the questions that we shared a week or two ago. Should we just plow through them? How do you want to do this? I'm tempted to let you take over because you're so good at that.
We could just plow through them and then answer any questions that come up that you feel we need to address.
Give us at least 5 minutes at the end for questions, or even 10 if we have that much time. So yeah, let's start plowing. I'm going to mute myself. You guys can see the questions. I guess I can't mute myself. Oh, there we go.
All right, so the first question that Dr. Crowe gave us was, which of all of the required YA books that we read in class was the most challenging in terms of content, and what in particular made that book challenging to read? So I can kind of go first. The most challenging book for me was The Hate U Give, which is a book by Angie Thomas that deals with police brutality and kind of like survivor's guilt, as well as questions of race and identity and code switching. And that was the most challenging book for me to read, I think, because my family has some negative experience with police, and it was like kind of a lowercase t traumatizing like experience to read that book for me. Really hard and emotionally like taxing, which was the only kind of experience that I had for one of those books. But yeah, that's what I'll be focusing my comments on.
Rachel, can you mention about how many books you read this semester?
Oh, I read about 36. I think that was pretty average for our class, what we read.
Jump on that bandwagon as well. I also, the hardest read for me was also The Hate You Give. And that was a little bit separate because for me, having served in West Africa, I got called out a lot for having white skin. And so it was like the kind of like the racism that's portrayed in The Hate You Give was kind of exactly how I felt in West Africa, just being kind of treated separately, kind of being treated differently. And so that made it really difficult for me, and it kind of brought up all those kind of negative emotions and really just angry kind of feelings that I had while I was serving there because of racial differences and kind of like stereotypes and things like that. So that was the hardest part for me for sure, is just kind of having to go back and deal with all that stuff, but in a slightly more mature way than I was doing it as a missionary.
I can go next. I think when I was thinking of this question, I would say there weren't many of the books. I feel like each one dealt with kind of a specific issue or like a harder topic to read about. And I think two that stand out to me that were a little bit more difficult were Staying Fat for Sarah Burns, and then also Marcello in the Real World. And I think both of those were interesting because in very different ways, they both talked about topics of religion. And Marcello in the Real World talks a lot about just like spirituality and views of religion, also in relation to like love and romance and sex. And then I think for Staying Fat for Sarah Burns, there was lots of some like contentious conversations within the book talking about Christianity related to some like abortion and also just human life in general and who God is. Like, does God exist and what kind of God is he? And so I think those were difficult for me in a different way where they really allowed me to consider a lot of my personal beliefs and religious beliefs and just kind of really examine those through a different lens.
I'll go next. So I've been able to take a class with Chris 3 different times, and all 3 times the most difficult book was The Chocolate War. And that was until today. This book, After the First Death, is by far the most difficult book I've ever had to read. And it's because I have children now. I have 6 children, and one of them is 5. And in the book, a bus is taken hostage, like a whole busload of students, young children that are 5 or 6 are taken hostage. And although that's not the focus of the book, it was very hard for me to look outside of that to understand what the focus of the book was and what Cormier, the author's intention was in creating that book. So that's my difficult one.
In kind of a similar vein, I would honestly say the different books that we read were all challenging to an extent, just because I think that's one of the main features of YA Lit is because you're dealing with a pretty vulnerable age range of people and of characters. It just kind of naturally lends itself to some really difficult issues. But I also felt like the books that we read were enjoyable at the same time. But 2 of the ones that I felt like were maybe kind of extra challenging to read in comparison to the others were The Chocolate War by Robert Cormier, that kind of explores the lengths that young boys will go to in some of their battles for power and kind of pushing back against different systems. And then the book Go Ask Alice, that is supposedly the journal or recovery journal of a young girl who finds herself kind of caught up in the world of drugs and kind of the different avenues that leads her down. And so I think both of those were heavy topics. I I honestly enjoyed both the books a lot, but it also put me into quite the sad headspace because I think the other trademark of Violet that I love is that I feel like it's inherently hopeful. Like I think that that's something that Violet has that maybe other types of fiction maybe don't as often, but both of these texts end maybe less hopeful than a lot of other ones that I've read.
I'll go next. Yeah, like Kristie and Kaylee already said, Chocolate War. Oh man. That one's a hard one to get through. But you two already explained Robert Cormier pretty well, so I'll skip the explanation of that one. Two others that I read that I thought were very challenging to read. One of them was Feed by M.T. Anderson. That one is dystopian, and anything you think is wrong in the world or could go wrong in the world seems to go wrong in that world. It's very bleak. The ending is pretty bleak. And actually something that stood out to me in that book that usually doesn't is the language in that book was really hard for me to read. Really stark, and lots of four-letter words that we don't usually use every sentence. So that was that one. And Speak was another one that really affected me. And I think it was a different reason. I mean, this is a girl in high school who has been raped, and she doesn't, I mean, the whole book is about her learning to speak up because no one knows about this. This is a secret. And it was so well written, I think, that I felt so much empathy for this girl. And it was a hard time getting through that book because I was in a dark place, but it was so well done. And I gained so much empathy for this character. So like Kaylee said about her books, I really appreciated all three of these books. They were hard, but I appreciate them. And I think there are things to learn, which we'll talk about later in this discussion.
So in looking for, the second question talks about looking for a good report when reading challenging books. And if it's okay, I'll go ahead and start with that because that is the mindset that I have to take reading anything by Cormier. And I've read 4 now by him because like exposure therapy, guys. So looking for the good report, I was very thankful that Dr. Crowe encouraged us to learn more about the authors, because then I learned more about what their objectives were and their purposes and like how they truly felt about young people. And so in reading after the first death, I kept assuming that there was something to be learned here. And I kept hoping and also praying, I'm like, please help me be able to find what I need to find from this to be able to learn what it is I need to learn. And that is what helped me get through the book, through some of the very, very, very difficult things that Cormier described. I mean, he's so psychological and he gets into your head, and that is intentional and purposeful. And so trying to think and understand, okay, what is it that he would have me learn, and what is it that the Holy Ghost would actually have me learn from such a difficult text? Those things help me through it. I don't know if like we're supposed to actually go into very specific detail. I will later if you want me to, but I appreciated this question because that's a coping strategy that I used every single time I was in your class, Dr. Crowe, looking for the good report in these books. And it helps. It helps a lot.
I would say something kind of similar. I think one thing that has helped me just across my studies, especially in the last couple of years, a lot of scholars talk about this, but one of the ones that I feel like I draw from is Louise Rosenblatt, and she talks a lot about how anytime we approach a text, we come to it with all of our previous experiences. It's not just like a reader looking at a bunch of words. We're bringing in every single thing that we've experienced or read or whatever, which is why if we approach a text for like the second, third, fourth time in our lives, it's a completely different experience. And so I think a lot of it comes down to what lenses we choose to use to interpret the things that we're reading. So, for me, I feel like it helps to just kind of naturally have a level of that, whether you want to call it a gospel lens or a spiritual lens or whatever type of lens you want to bring to it. And it helps you kind of understand what's going on and kind of take away what you need to. And so I don't think it means that we need to impose our beliefs on the characters or like judge the characters based on our views or things like that, but I think it can help us be a little bit more evaluative. So I think about it when I was reading Go Ask Alice, my heart was breaking the whole time. And I think, you could read that as maybe like a cautionary tale, just because a lot of the things she does throughout the book are things that different leaders within our faith kind of warn us against. And so it kind of shows you a lot of that evidence, or can show you the tactics that other people or the adversary can kind of apply. But then also, I think taking on this different lens, when I was reading it, all I could feel the whole time, in addition to sadness, was just empathy, because everything that she was experiencing, they were things that I never experienced, not as an adult and not as a young adult at all. And so I felt like because I had taken on that lens, it completely changed how I viewed different people that I interacted with. And so, at the very least, even with books that I feel like couldn't be more far removed from our faith, I think sometimes when we apply that lens, it can help us get a better understanding of the different people that we're around. And that is kind of entrenched within Christianity.
One thing that I was thinking about, as I was thinking about, like, how we look for a good report, William Wordsworth is like quoted as saying like that his poems are like emotion recollected in tranquility, where he's talking about like these big things that are happening, this big sadness, deep emotions, but when he's in a peaceful place. And I think that looking for the good report isn't something that I was doing as I was reading. It was something that when I came to class, I was forced to reflect back on this book, which potentially was like this really emotionally intense book for me to read. And I had to think, what was good about this? Like, how can I be content about this book and how it is? And that like creates a little bit of cognitive dissonance where it's like, I have all of these emotions. They're really strong and usually like a little negative. And also I have this sense that this is good. And I think that having that cognitive dissonance is the best place to be in an analytical mode, where you're able to see the good and the bad and to have to like sew them together in order to make, the quilt that is that book. So that's kind of what I'm thinking of.
I think one thing for me is this a little bit better for you guys. So one thing for me, perfect, is that like when we were reading our books, like similar to Rachel, like while you're reading like a really hard book, you're just like reading through it. Like it's you're not like thinking, oh wow, this is such good like about the book. It's just really like hard in the moment. And then once you have the time afterwards, you're like, oh yeah, like I can see, especially when you're talking to other people about it, like talking to other people about like what you're reading and especially how it's making you feel in the moment. I've been trying to like over the last couple months been like reading a lot of like self-development books and like how can I become a better person myself? And like one of the things I've been discovering is like, well, why does this situation make me feel this way? Because if it's making you feel in a negative way, then a lot of the times like that's kind of a you problem. Like why am I feeling this way from this situation? Because I have control over how I feel and I can control my emotions. So when something makes me feel this like way that's like really hard and or it makes me sad or it makes me angry, like why is this making me feel this way? And is there something I can do to fix that? So with like the hate you give, for me it was like okay, I got to sort out why this racial like thing is making it so hard for me to read this book, right? And so it's like, okay, I got to figure out myself, like, why is this difficult? Try and untwist like what these like, I don't even know what you call it, but these mental like traps in your head that you've had buried there for like a long time, and then they just kind of rise up. And I think that's one of the best things in all the books is like figuring out like, oh man, this book really like turns me off. Like this book really just makes me vexed or angry. And then being able to say, why does it do that? And it's so good I like read that book so I can figure out for myself I have this weakness or I have this flaw in me so I can iron it out. So I think for me, like that's the best way I find things of good report in books that are hard is trying to iron out in me those flaws and trying to make them better because of the hard things I've read.
I think I'm going to echo a little bit of what was just said, which was really great. Thank you for your comment. Um, I feel like when I'm reading a book, in the middle of reading a book, I'm not thinking about what is a good report or praiseworthy. Sometimes I'm like, there is nothing good worthy or praiseworthy in this book. But it's really getting to the end and reflection that really causes that. And sometimes, I mean, great things like this where you're discussing with others and trying to figure out how you and others work together with this text, that really helps me to find those good things. Sometimes it's not coming from me. Sometimes it's coming from someone else's comment that really helps me to understand, oh, that is something really important that I didn't gain when I read that, but you took away that's a really profound comment or really deep insight. So grateful for everyone else for your just comments and insights about books. And yeah, I feel like I have to get to the end first sometimes before I can really find that good stuff. But it does come. It has always come, at least so far. At the end, I have found things. So, yeah.
You need to read more Cormier then. He doesn't have anything at the end. Oh, I shouldn't say that, but I did. Okay, so I think I don't know if you guys saw this, but there was a social media post by Elder Rasband where he essentially said everybody has something that he can learn from. Everybody has something to offer. And I reflect back on that. Like nobody would take this much time and intention to write a book unless they felt it was important. And I feel that it's so important to give them time and space, my time and space to read the book and see what it is I can learn from. So then like that goes to the next thing, like how would a trigger warning have affected your reading of a challenging book? This is new. I haven't seen trigger warnings in too many of the original young adult texts. I think if they're like, when I first saw this question, the first thing that I thought of is like, well, it seems as though the text that I've read that had trigger warnings, the main part of the book had nothing to do necessarily with the trigger warning. Like, that wasn't the point of the book. That triggering incident was not the point of the book. So I'm just wondering if like you agree, disagree. I don't know. Like if there's a trigger warning, I'm like, okay, let's get into this. I want to see what the book is actually about aside from this trigger.
Yeah,
Oh.
I totally agree. Sorry, Claire, I cut you off.
No, you go.
I think that there are kind of like two categories of books. All of them like dealt with at least one like really hard issue. But I think that there are like books like Speak, and there are books like Staying Fat for Sarah Burns, where you kind of like are just left in the dark about like what exactly is going on. And then it's like, boom, here's the scene. Here's like the like what happened, why there's so much emotional distress. And there are other books then like The Hate U Give, where the whole book, it, starts out with police brutality. And it's just, grappling with that amongst other things, but that's a major theme. And so I think that, for books where it's like, kind of something that you're like leading up to, like Staying Fat for Sarah Burns, you kind of like almost don't want that trigger warning because it feels like a spoiler alert as well. Where it's like, oh, well, now I like know why this character is so sad or distressed all the time. It's like, because I had a trigger warning. And so, I think there are really good arguments for trigger warnings or content warnings and the lack thereof. But I do think that they would be more helpful in books that are completely about like a potentially triggering theme.
Let me go back a second to that question about a good report. How would you explain what a good report is? What does that mean in the context of reading challenging books?
I'll go ahead and try to answer this question. And also it looks like we have the question from someone about what is a trigger warning. So it seems like we might need to define just some of these words that we have been using. So I think first of all, with a good report, when we say good report, we're referring to one of the articles of faith in our faith, which basically is talking about seeking after things that are of good report or worth learning about and maybe positive or enlightening in some way. And then I would just, I guess, I think I will go ahead and define trigger warning just because I'd like to share, I guess, my opinion on that a little bit. And then Kaylee, if you have anything to add about more about trigger warnings, I just know trigger warnings are just a little bit of like an advisory, maybe a little note at the beginning of a book saying like trigger warning. This book is going to, yes, talk about, oh yes, there's one in All My Rage. I think that's the one that you have, right? Where it's just talking about like, hey, this book maybe deals with things like drug use or sexual assault, some of these harder topics that could be potentially triggering or traumatic for someone to read about, especially if they've had those sort of experiences that could do more harm for them, reading something that could be, again, triggering or traumatizing for them. And I just quickly wanted to say, as far as, I also don't really know where I stand on like, should there be trigger warnings? I think they can really benefit those who could be at risk of, again, being like re-traumatized by reading something. I don't think that would be good for them to expose themselves to. But at the same time, when I look at a book like I mentioned before, Marcello in the Real World, it has some like sexual content, I would say, in it, where they have conversations about sex and about like what it means when it's like more romantic and out of love, and what it means when maybe it's someone's being taken advantage of. And I think if I were to have just seen like a trigger warning outside of the book saying like sexual explicit material, or they used the F word this many times, things like that, I think I would have been a little turned away because I didn't have as holistic of a view of the purpose that these things serve in the book. And so I think that's one thing that really guides me when I read books, is I think there's so many great books out there, so many books that we read in this class where the triggering, or maybe especially coming from a religious standpoint, things that people could consider bleak or inappropriate or things like that, when those things appear in books, I always try to look at like, what is the purpose that it's serving? Like, is it just this fluff that's not helping the story, or am I learning a lesson? And I think by reading that book, I learned so much about like how I would view love. And I think it's very actually in line with Christ-like values of like cherishing another person. And so anyway, sorry, that was a lot, but that's just what I have to say on that.
I think that was a lot of really great stuff. So I am personally really glad that you talked about that. And I think you defined trigger warning really well, where it's more just, like that statement or something at the beginning that can kind of alert the reader to anything that might be distressing. And I, like everyone else, am also kind of on the fence with this because I think about all of the young adult literature that I've read. And again, there's so much of it where, trigger warning might have dissuaded me from reading it, and I would have lost a lot of really interesting experiences and insights from that. And I remember even in our class that we had with Chris this spring, a different professor from BYU had mentioned how because of some of the initial warnings that were given to the class, there were students who were opting out of reading a text, but it was less about content and more about sadness, more about the fact that the book was sad or that it was painful. And I think that that can do us a real disservice, because I kind of think part of why I'm okay with some of those like challenging things that come up in the book is I feel like as part of humanity, I have some sort of an obligation to like carry some of that burden and to know about some of the pain that exists in the world. So I kind of go back and forth. I know we talk like all the time, the phrase is used how literature can serve as, you know, a window or a mirror. And I think what can be difficult is if I think of triggering material, the place where I could see that be concerning is if the text is kind of a mirror to your life, if it is something that can bring up experiences that you've had that have been extremely painful or traumatic. But when it's kind of the window side, like I said, I kind of feel like we have kind of an obligation to know about those things and to experience them to an extent. And I think about my own students. This is where I get a little bit more on the fence on the whole issue is the target audience for young adult literature is young adults. And so they're minors and they're young. And I think about it, and this will kind of lead into one of our later questions, but like I, as an adult in my 20s, can know if content is something that I can handle or not, if it's something that I can keep going with or not, or if it's something difficult, I know what resources I can go to be able to cope with that, whether it's discussions with peers or classmates or, you know, other types of resources. But teenage readers might not always have that, and they might not always have that awareness as they're reading. And so I think about it, and with my own students, I use a lot of young adult literature, and I have to, for the sake of my job, give some disclaimers. And I try to avoid spoilers and things like that. But I know in particular when we were doing a set of like book club groups using young adult literature, I had to provide parents with the warnings when the students were kind of opting into what books they could do and when parents were signing off on them. But interestingly enough, I remember using the book Speak that has been brought up in this discussion, and I had multiple female students who had opened up about experiences with sexual assault in the past. And of those students, a good amount of them opted into reading Speak because they wanted a place to be able to kind of read about and process their experiences. But then I had a couple who, for that reason, chose not to read that book. And so that's where I think it can be kind of difficult because it just kind of depends on the person. So where it's specifically geared towards young adults, that's where I think it gives me a little bit of pause.
Thanks, Claire and Kaylee. I just feel like you've said all the things. I just kind of want to say amen. Great, just great discussion. I just wanted to add, I feel like Kaylee just mentioned, there's definitely a place for trigger warnings. And I think there are some people that really need them, like Kaylee talked about. And I've specifically heard about people who are dealing with really difficult mental health challenges like suicide. And really, that's really triggering to read about. So knowing that beforehand is very important for individuals like that, for example. Where someone like me who has not had those kinds of experiences, my philosophy right now is if I see a trigger warning, I just skip it. Because as others have already pointed out, sometimes that can dissuade me from reading something when that's not the point of the book, where for someone else, that could be very important for them to know before they're going in because they have had traumatic experiences. So I think there's a place for it. I think for me, it's not helpful for me, so I don't use it. But I think because it can be a tool for others, I think it's a good thing to have available. If you don't need it, skip it, is what I say. So.
Well, if you don't need it, skip it. That kind of leads into the next question, even though that's not what your intention was, as it related to trigger warnings. But like, when do you know, or how do you know? Well, the original question is, when do you know you should put a book down? This was a hard question for me because I've only done it once. And I still don't know if that was the best choice. But I just want to know, when do you know when to put a book down?
I think that's a really hard question. And I think I kind of mentioned it earlier how I feel like it's easier as you get older. I feel like I look at some of my students, and some of them are in a place where they do know where their boundaries are on things, but a lot of them are just in a space of just constant consumption. But for me personally, and especially coming from a religious perspective, I think part of it is paying attention to like the feeling that I gain from the text, because I look at it and like I think there's a lot of pieces of young adult literature that I genuinely do classify as like high quality literature. And I think when I think of those pieces, if they have had content that does seem a little bit more adult, whether that's, language or violence or sexual content or whatever, I think when I think of those types of books, these ones that I consider really high quality, I think the authors are very, very careful with how they incorporate those elements. And if they are incorporated, it's very intentional. And it, is important to the characters or to the story. And I feel like it's usually pretty tasteful. Whereas if I'm reading something and it starts to feel really excessive or gratuitous or something like that, then that for me is kind of the no. But I think, again, a lot of it comes down to the feeling that I feel, because I do think it's true, even if it's not necessarily because of content. I think if you're reading something, like there is a moment where you can tell like if the spirit's with you still or not, or if there's this space of darkness. Because again, like some of those texts that I mentioned, like Go Ask Alice, like that's a pretty dark story. And yeah, I didn't feel like this, I don't know, I didn't feel off about it, if that makes sense. But there are other books that have brought that feeling. So I don't think I could ever classify for myself, oh, if it has this, or this, it's a no, because it just kind of depends on how the author chooses to do it and how it shows up in the story, which is, I think it's good to be aware and sometimes to be in dialogue with other people, even just in dialogue with your own beliefs, or taking the things you're reading and putting those kind of in conversation, I guess, with your own personal beliefs.
One thing that I'm thinking, so putting a book down, I think there are like two different ways to, even think about that phrase. There's like putting it down where it's like where you're going to pick it back up, but it's just too much right now. There's also like putting it down, like just giving up on the book. And I think that like I would only give up on a book if I felt like I didn't have reason to continue with it, right? Books in this class that we are reading were extremely vetted and, have some sort of like rationale for them. And so that didn't seem like a huge option. Like I was going to miss out on something. But with The Hate You Give, I put down that book many times. And I think that the biggest thing was just like, listening to my body, where it's like I would feel nauseous. I just was just crying, couldn't emotionally like control myself. And it's like, when you're in a state of emotional distress, I don't think it's like ever healthy to just continue on without a pause or a break. I think that scheduling is also a big thing, which can be as little as like, oh, well, you've got to go to class now, you should put the book down. But it can also be like, I remember I was like at the gym reading on the treadmill, and it was like I had to factor in that I was like just on the verge of emotional distress and I had class in 30 minutes. And so if I continued reading, then it would bump into my schedule, right? So I think that kind of a combination of listening to your body and knowing what your like surrounding external factors are a big thing for taking breaks from books.
I would totally reinforce that, Rachel, because it's like whenever I hear the phrase like put a book down, I'm like, yeah, it's like toast, like you're never going to pick it up again. So I love the clarification on that. And also just like sometimes like especially for those who have dealt with like addiction of some sort, there we go. Addiction of some sort, it's like as soon as you like can start reading something, if it like in my experience, then it's like, well, you just can't stop reading. So I think one of the biggest things is to like be like super aware that like if you have dealt with an addiction in the past or like something like that that's like not good to bring up, but you're like trying to deal with it, then like being really conscious of like, okay, like I can put this book down. I'm like going to take this really slow, like right here where I can tell like it's really, really hard for me right now. Like being aware of that and being having the self-control to do that, which is not something I see in a lot of like young teenagers, especially. So I think it's especially important, like when we recommend books, that like we understand like who we're recommending this book to, and saying like, okay, like I feel like you're able to deal with this, like you should totally, like if anything comes up, then feel free to like put the book down, and instead of like keep on reading and then just kind of going into this downward spiral of like kind of like relapse or whatever, because that's never okay to like to feel like you have to get through something because someone like told you like, oh, this is a great book, like you got to read this, and then be like, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm gonna like relapse or something like this because of these things. And so I think being okay with like not being able to deal with everything and being okay to put the book down is like even the first thing. And then being like, okay, now I know like when is good for like me personally and like my feelings and like my past experience, like the baggage we talked about earlier.
Does anyone else want to talk about when they felt they should put a book down? Okay. Oh, Natalie, you unmuted and then muted.
You caught me.
But I won't force you. You can set a boundary.
Basically what's already been said by multiple of you is what I was going to say. So yeah, I mean, I don't really have anything to add. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for supporting. Okay. So then the rationale or justification is the next question. And I think it's the final one. Is it? Oh, it's not. Okay. So it's 8 o'clock. There are 2 questions left. Do you want to just hold up which one you want to do, 5 or 6? Which rationale or justification can you give for reading bleak or challenging books? There's 2 of you. And then has there been a book that has disturbed or repelled? You know what? Just answer whatever you want. That's the best way to do it. So
Okay.
you know what the last 2 questions are.
I can kind of take that because mine are a little bit, my answers for the 2 of those are kind of tied to each other, and then everyone can take it whatever direction you want. But I kind of mentioned before how I feel like, yes, within bounds, but like I do think that we have a level of responsibility to know what life is like for other people. I think that's the biggest thing that I've seen for myself as I've read books, but specifically as I've studied young adult literature and as I've helped students to study those stories. It's a big way that we can kind of enhance our empathy for other people in the world. When I've read stories, like I think one of the ones that I read towards the end of my time in Dr. Crow's class was the book Sold, and that was one of the heaviest books that I've read in a while. It features parents, specifically a father who sells his daughter into sex trafficking. And it was a really, really hard read. But I also felt like it was really important for me to read it. I felt like it was important for me to see it through because like that's a reality for people, and I'm lucky that that hasn't been my reality. But the level of understanding and awareness and empathy that I gained just from that piece of fiction alone was really immense. And I felt that same way when I was reading Go Ask Alice. You know, I think it's a really important way that we can kind of connect with other people. And I think about watching my own students, the types of conversations that they would have in class, like at the start of the year, but as we read stories, particularly young adult literature, that kind of connected them with experiences very different from their own. The deeper and more mature understanding that they had about people's life experiences was really, really interesting to see. Even if they didn't fully agree with choices people were making, there was this level of, you know what? I can understand, I can see how context would lead a person to think this, and it might not necessarily be how they would respond to a situation, but it gives them that little bit of understanding and the ability to give grace. And so I think a lot of these books, they show truth, they show what is happening in the world. And then more than that, like I said before, I think young adult literature is especially good at kind of interweaving hope amongst those things. A lot of those books that I feel like I read, you see these really bleak, horrible situations, but then you also see characters finding, you know, really beautiful parts of life amidst that, or you see them being able to like use those experiences to fuel their growth. And yeah, some books it's a little bit easier to see that than others, but I remember Jeff Zentner talking to us about how, his books, a lot of people are like, man, his books always make me cry. They're so sad, but he always talks about his books as being really hopeful, and I would agree with that. I think that I look at my students, and I know I brought them up a lot, but where they're kind of the target age for a lot of these books, a lot of them read his books or some of these other ones and talked about how helpful it was to see other people experiencing either experiences like their own or just really difficult things and moving through those. And that's a big part of life, but especially adolescence, where it's kind of the first time where you're dealing with really like heavy or real life situations for the first time. I think it's really hopeful to be able to see like how people manage that in the world.
That's beautiful. You talking about your students made me think about me talking about my young adults in my household. And I asked my daughter, I said, hey, what's the most difficult text you've read? And she said, well, it's the one you just made me read. So Mother of the Year. But I said, oh, really, why? And it was she described it as a very disturbing and she felt explicit scene. And she said, but Mom, that wasn't the point of the book. The point was that I realized that you don't have to be a member of the Church of Jesus Christ to make good choices. And I didn't realize that until I read the book that you gave me and saw the goodness that exists in other experiences, times, backgrounds, and people. And I was like, wow. And so that is actually what edified me and helped me carry through when I read this Cormier book that I just read today. And I think the reason why I was really glad to have read this particular book, even though at first I was very fearful, like I had a physical response to the book of fear, like my heart rate. I mean, I almost had a panic attack. And I realized it was because the author Robert Cormier and many other authors of young adult texts have a gift for being able to put you in a position of agency. As you're relating to the characters, even with like the literary structure, I mean, that's a whole other conversation. Like this book, literary criticism all over the place. Like he creates on purpose this position for you to realize the agency that you have. And that's one thing that I was so glad to have willingly gone through the experience to read, to realize the gift of my agency and what I could do with it. So I guess I kind of sort of answered question number 6, but that's one thing that always comes up. And that goes along with what Kaylee said about Jeff Zentner. Like he said he has this obligation to provide hope for his readers. And I think that's necessary. Oh, sorry, now I'm babbling, but like it's just such a common experience in these texts that there are hard things, but then there's also the invitation to hope, and then you get to choose what you're going to focus on and realize how you're going to use your agency. So that's why I enjoy these books in the end.
I think that bleeds really well with also like question 5 too, is like, why even read these in the first place? Because like it's really hard to like get a window into someone's life without stepping into their shoes, like we talk about with YA books. And it's just like like not not very many people like leave their like state even or like country to go and see what it's like to live in someone else's like town or city or like that and try to really empathetically like relate to people. And even if you do that, like it's very specific usually to like one like demographic or a like type of people. But by being able to read books that are really hard and challenging like this, you're just able to empathize with people on a whole new level from an incredibly diverse number of backgrounds and be able to finally understand, oh, why they would do that stuff. I feel like one of the biggest problems we have in our day and age is that we are so ignorant of how other people feel, and we just kind of throw everyone into this box of whether it's politics or religion or whatever it is. And people are way more complex than any one box or even 10 boxes of stereotypes could fit them into. And being able to like get someone's perspective, as most YA books are from like first person perspective, being able to get into their head and be able to see like, wow, like this is like how you think, and I can understand why you think this way. And now I can see why a bunch of other people who are in your same situation might also think this way. And it just allows you to be so much more empathetic and try and be better children of God by just loving people more, because we don't see them as like cardboard cutouts, instead seeing them as people who are really trying to do the best that they can in whatever the situation may be, especially like from All My Rage, right? Where he's just like trying to help out his family or whatever. And so he does some things that I'm pretty sure all of us would be like, oh my gosh, I would never deal drugs, right? Or I would never touch like this thing, like it's a sin or whatever, right? Because, you know, we're members of the church like that, and we try and restrict things. But being able to like understand people and relate to people in a better way, and as like trying to be better missionaries for God and share the love with people, you got to first understand people before you can really start to love them, or else it's just kind of hollow-ish love.
Yeah, I think Micah like really focused on like the windows that books can have right into other people's lives. And I think that is the primary function of YA literature in like reality. Because it's like, you know, probably not even half of students graduate high school feeling like they read a book that was like, that resonated with them, that like showed them a view into their own life in some way. But I do think that like those mirror books are super important, where if you're seeing yourself struggling, especially as an adolescent, you're like having a lot of big feelings and don't necessarily have all the words for them, because your limbic system is growing disproportionately to your frontal lobe. And so it's like, you really want to see these words and be like, these are real words. Like I could communicate this experience now. And I think that anyway, so the question that we're answering is, what rationale or justification can you give for reading bleak or challenging books? And I think the like easy answer is because life is bleak and challenging, right? And so when you're seeing yourself in like, this is my struggle, I think that's huge. That said, I am going to also focus on windows a bit, because I do think that is more practical. And I think that I really, like Kaylee said, have like a religious moral obligation to, you know, mourn with those that mourn, and to like bear one another's burdens. I think that like witnessing is a huge thing, and that like challenging books prepare us to look out for others, right? When you read about, you know, in Speak, it's just this like girl that like kind of abandons all of her friends as she's trying to deal with like the trauma of her sexual assault. And it's like, you know, as a teenager reading that, a big takeaway you can have is my friend that just stopped talking with us all of a sudden and is like reclusive. Like maybe there's something I should look out for and I should still be there for them. I pulled up a quote from Rowan Williams, who is a Welsh Anglican bishop, where he talks about baptism and the covenant that we make. And I really love it and think it's pertinent. He says, to be able to say I'm baptized is not to claim an extra dignity, let alone a sort of privilege that keeps you separate from and superior to the rest of the human race, but to claim a new level of solidarity with other people. It is to accept that to be a Christian is to be affected. You might even say contaminated by the mess of humanity. This is very paradoxical. Baptism is a ceremony in which we are washed, cleansed, and recreated. It is also a ceremony in which we are pushed into the middle of a human situation that may hurt us and that will not leave us untouched or unsullied. And the gathering of baptized people is therefore not a convocation of those who are privileged, elite, and separate, but of those who have accepted what it means to be in the heart of a needy, contaminated, messy world. So I think that the world of YA literature is one that is kind of forcing kids to see there are people like everyone is suffering, first of all, and we're suffering in really different ways. And you like need to have some sort of witness to that. And I'm going to kind of bleed into the next question, which is about a book that repelled me and that I'm still glad to read. And I think like the most like disgusted I ever was, The Hate U Give, I was just like constantly and like raised emotion. But the biggest like one moment for me was in Staying Fat for Sarah Burns. There's this really vivid depiction of child abuse that just was absolutely awful. Like, and I just like felt so disgusted by it. But in retrospect, I'm really glad that I had that text because I think it helped me to like learn to cope with vivid descriptions of awful things. And about a month after I started reading that text, I began volunteering with a sexual assault hotline and hospital response team, and was pretty regularly hearing vivid descriptions of awful things without kind of the comfort of like, this is fictional or this is like a text and I can step away from it at any point. And so I think that in that way, it's like, you know, when you step into the real world, you see these issues and they are actually this vivid and disgusting. And it's like kind of a practice of dipping your toes in that water, like to be able to gain the emotional capacity of witnessing. So those are my thoughts.
I just wanted to say I really like being able to read these books and also doing so in such kind of a unique space of being able to be surrounded by other people with similar beliefs. And it feels, and kind of like what you're talking about, Rachel, is what reminded me of it is, you know, you talk about the difference of reading something that's like a fictional work that most likely, you know, is based off of something that is real happening in the world, but then having to come to terms with some of those really difficult things happening in real life from, you know, real people recounting them. And so I do think that in some ways these books can be like, even though they can be bleak and distressing, they can also in a way be kind of these safe spaces and these safe like portals into that world. And I just saw we just have some questions about that just ask about like how our process was in Professor Crowe's class, talking about discussion, like how did we approach that? How did we spend a full semester talking about young adult literature with others? And I think it was just really cool being in that class because it just felt like we were kind of like a family or community of people that we just had these discussions. And some days, like there was one time when we read The Serpent King by Jeff Sentner, which I think was probably like my favorite book out of that class. And it was so cool because Dr. Crowe he sat in the back, and that was one day where he said, okay, I'm going to let you lead the discussion. And so it just felt very guided where we were talking about the characters. And that is just one thing that I think is really valuable, is being able to have kind of this safe environment where you can ask questions about the things that you read, or maybe you didn't like a book as much, but then someone next to you said, well, this was my favorite book because, and they're able to see a different perspective. And so I think that's really great. And books really are the opportunity. You can read them by yourself, but then they can also provide this chance to ask questions. And so when you are especially reading books from like diverse perspectives, which I think is extremely important, it might be helpful for you to read that like on your own and get some sort of exposure to it. And that can help you get the sort of confidence that you might need to approach someone and ask them questions and try to learn more about other people.
Okay, I want to quick jump in and do those last two questions before we move totally on, because I have a lot to say about bleak literature in particular. We've talked a lot about windows, and I think you guys have covered that so well. I think bleak books that end bleakly, we don't talk about those as much, and there isn't as much of it in YA, and a lot of people don't like it, right? Or don't think it even has a place in YA literature. So I wanna defend it a little bit. And Kristie jokingly said, Robert Cormier, nothing hopeful about him, but I want to say that I have found some things. So I want to talk about that really quickly. So yeah, the question 5, what rationale or justification can you give for reading bleak or challenging books? Well, I immediately thought of Mormon 8. Moroni is writing and he's like, my father was killed. I remain alone. Whether they slay me, I know not. Whither I go, it mattereth not. I am alone. That's pretty bleak, right? That's a super bleak ending. What I think is really interesting about Moroni is that even though, like, I don't know how much more bleak you can get than the life he's living there and the things that he's saying, he ends this whole story with hope, right? There is hope. And I think even though, I mean, he paints a very bleak picture of his future on Earth, he finds hope there. And I think we can do that too with bleak texts. So, for example, I will just put questions 5 and 6 together. Question 6 was, has there been a book that disturbed or repelled you that you're glad you read? So back to the Chocolate War and Feed. When I look at the Chocolate War, the ending is so bleak. We have a character, he's the hero of the story. We don't know if he's going to survive at the end. He's been so physically beaten and abused. And even he admits, I feel like I've a little bit become the people that I don't want to become. That's bleak. That is so bleak, right? But I think the question that I asked myself at the end of these bleak stories is, how do I keep that from happening? What do I do so that I don't become like that? And I think that's a very empowering question. And I think it can be an empowering question for teens too. I remember when I was a teen, I felt like life was pretty bleak a lot of the time, even though I think I've come to see things a little differently as I've grown older. I do see, I do remember feeling like life was bleak, but I think that question that you can ask yourself at the end of these bleak stories, how can I keep that from happening? What can I do? How can I be empowered so that I'm not like the guys in this book, can be really helpful. So for example, in the Chocolate War, in the end, you've had all these characters that have talked with our main character throughout the book, Jerry, who've said, oh yeah, I'm going to stand with you. I'm going to help you with this. And they end up chickening out and they don't help him and he's all alone. The question, I mean, the thing that went through my mind at the end was, well, what would have happened if they had joined him? This would have been a totally different story. They could have had this amazing uprising and been so heroic. Things could have turned out so differently. So in my life, am I going to be someone who's just a watcher from the sidelines? Am I just going to watch as bad things happen? Or am I going to be actively involved? And I think that's a really empowering question, actually, even though it's a bleak story. And the same with Feed, this book, where at the ending, people's skin is falling off their faces, the environment is dying, people are consuming things and they don't care about the planet. They've got fake food and fake air. And they use a news feed to connect with each other instead of actual, interpersonal human connection. They've forgotten how to be human. It's a horrible ending. It's so sad. But I read this book 5 years ago and I still can't get it out of my head. It has totally changed the way that I have interacted with social media, how I've interacted with other people. I mean, it taught me, social media is trying to tell me that I'm having a real interpersonal reaction with someone when I like their post, but I'm not. that's not how you connect on a really deep and personal level, right? Or, where is this thing that I am buying coming from? Am I harming people by using it? And I think, and it really has, it's changed my life by reading this YA book. And I think even though these bleak books are hard, I still think there can be beautiful things that come out of them and empowering things for teen that come out of them if we look at them and maybe help teens to see how it can be empowering for them. So that's my answer to that question.
Amen, Natalie. I totally agree with you. And I hope it's not too much of a spoiler, but in one of Cormier's books, he literally places you in the head of another, and then they're gone, leaving you forced to decide, what will I do? And then he places you into the head of another person, and then they're gone. Again, leaving you forced to decide, what am I going to do? And then another one, then they're gone, and another one, and another one. And it's that same message that you were talking about. It's also bleak, but then when everything is stripped away, all that's left is, in the end, what do I choose? And that's so powerful, and it's so exciting. And yeah, so amen. And also, like, I was thinking about Alma and Amulek a lot when I was reading one of the horrific scenes in a book. I'm like, oh my gosh, okay, they made it. I'll make it. So yeah. Oh, thank you for that. Have you guys seen in the chat, there's just a couple questions, but Claire had addressed one beautifully. If anybody else wants to talk about the benefit of being able to have a beautiful support group in Professor Crowe's class. Like, I mean, I've been in his class 3 times and I'm helping him in the fall. Obviously, I love it. I love the support group. I love being able to read and then process my thinking and then put it into words, into writing. It's all just a beautiful connective learning experience, and it's absolutely necessary to be able to share that with others. And I think that one of the reasons, if you guys agree or disagree, say, but I think one of the reasons why we're able to form these close-knit relationships of trust is because we're all reading something that causes us to be deeply reflective and vulnerable, and then we're sharing it. And those types of interactive experiences bring us together. And I couldn't help but, ponder each time I had an experience like that. How can I replicate this with those that I love? How can I replicate this with my students? How can I replicate this with my peers, with family members? How can I read or be exposed to difficult things, process with other people, and then build from that? I think that is a really cool pattern that's established in Dr. Crowe's class in reading these difficult texts, so much that I'm willing to do it 4 different times.
All right. So, I think I would tack on to being deeply reflective, also mildly traumatized at the same time, because being able to go through and everyone's reading the same thing and everyone's coming away with different experiences is really interesting, just as a psychological demonstration of what affects people and why is this affecting you. And I don't know, it's just kind of interesting in that way. And then also, when people go through really hard things together, they're way more closely knit, and they can relate to each other. Instant friends start springing up. I'm I couldn't quote this anywhere, but there's got to be a study where it's you put people in a traumatic situation and they're just way deeply connected to each other. And I feel like that's kind of what happens in Professor Crowe's class. It's wow, we're all reading really tough things together. And maybe it's not tough for some people, but then seeing other people have a really hard time with that, you're oh, can I help you? Can we talk about this? Make it easier for you? The natural empathy that we tried to develop as people is just brought out, and we're able to just relate to each other way better. Understanding people comes from hearing them speak about how they feel about things, and being able to have such a discussion as we do in the class is not only able to help you process like how you're feeling, but also able to help everyone feel like, yeah, I mean, I could say what I'm feeling right now. Like it makes it way easier for especially like shy people or people who don't feel like they can speak up or have anything worth saying. Makes it like so much like better and more wholesome for them to be able to say, like, I'm valued here. Like I have something to say and I feel like it's going to be good.
Yeah, I'm totally with Mike. I was going to kind of go more on the trauma bonding side as well. And I think another element of that is like the content is hard. It was also a really hard class. Like we were reading minimum of 2 books a week, which is not something that I think really anyone else had been doing in normal practice beforehand. And you know, if you guys are doing like spring term, I can't even imagine, like that's like a book a day basically. You know, it's just there's so much. And so when you come to class, you kind of come with like this like pride of like, I finished that book. Like, you know, absolutely had to stay up until whatever like horrid hour of the night. Or, you know, like there's so much sacrifice that has to be made for this class. So we're all coming like having put in so much effort already. And so it's like you have to make it worth it. If you're going to be like doing that much intense work, you know, you have to come and just like have a really great discussion, or else you feel like all of your labor is in vain. And so in that way, it was like first day, you know, syllabus expectations are set, boom, we're all best friends, right? That's kind of how it felt for me.
I never thought of my class as a place of trauma. I feel bad for my students this coming semester. If they hear about this, they're going to run away terrified, but
Don't feel too bad, Professor.
so I don't know if we have any more questions, William. I just want to thank William for helping us get this connection going tonight and getting the Zoom working for us. This one just popped up. And I feel really blessed and lucky to work at BYU with students like this, who are really smart readers and are willing to take a leap of faith in reading books. And some students who are English majors come in skeptical of young adult books. It's beneath them. And so it's a range of backgrounds that come into a class. And I have to admit, this last year, the class I had in fall and the class I had in spring were like once in a lifetime experiences. I'm really worried about fall, this coming fall, that I'm going to be disappointed. It didn't measure up to the standard you guys set, but I think it's really important to be able to read tough text with the anchor of faith, as these guys have shown. So I think William wanted us to wait about 15 seconds and then we'll say goodbye here, but we'll close the session. Thanks you guys for your terrific insights and being willing to share what you shared tonight.